Hello, I'm Ness Hughes and I will be joining you for this week's devotionals as we work through the first half of Exodus. It's great to be with you for the Growing Disciples program in this way this week. I'm also following along the course with you week to week and we'll be journeying with you over the course of the year. And it's quite a journey, isn't it? Not just a personal experience and growth and encouragement as we understand and live out God's word, but also as we traverse the ups and downs of God's people in the stories of the Old Testament, seeing over and over the faith and failings of God's people, and over the faithfulness of God as he speaks and acts and works towards the redemption of his people and the fulfillment of his promises. Remember those three tracks of promise that we're following: land, nation, and blessing. A people of God living in his gifted and productive lands in relationship with him. We read a high point of God's people's experience of these promises back in Genesis 26, where under Isaac, things seemed pretty close to fulfillment. Though we hadn't yet discovered who the serpent crusher was, the ultimate defeater of evil, God's people were living in their land, flourishing and prospering, and devoted to God. And in that moment, God had instructed them in verse 2-3, do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land where I tell you to live. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and will bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands and will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. So as we turn now from Genesis and find God's people in Egypt, far from the land of promise, we should be wondering how they will get back on track, so to speak, toward the blessings God had promised. The threat now to God's promise is a mighty kingdom with a powerful Pharaoh. And so these are the background questions for us throughout the whole week. Will God be faithful to his people? And is he powerful enough to overcome the powerful foreign rule of Pharaoh? Well, let's read together now from chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labour. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labour in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labour, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Well, in 14 short verses, the story becomes very bleak. From the hopeful influence of Joseph to bonded labour and harsh treatment and oppression. Notice the repetition of that word, ruthless. They were at the hands of ruthless, harsh treatment. And yet God's people, the Hebrew families, grow and multiply. Their unbelievable fruitfulness is a double-edged sword for Pharaoh. They're significant in their ability to offer labour. They're a mighty labour force, and yet they're also massing enough numbers to become a considerable threat. And so in verse 22, Pharaoh gave this order. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Such a savage and brutal decree. The future power and might of the Hebrews in terms of their brute force in this generation of young men to be wiped out. What will God do? Well, let's read on now in chapter 2, where we see the narrative slow down and zero in on one particular family and one baby in particular, Moses. Now, a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. And she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Well, this Levite baby boy escapes death and is in a way reunited with his mother for a time, but also at the same time uniquely placed to have standing within Pharaoh's own household. Now, these coincidences and good fortune in the story are meant to be too unlikely to have taken place on their own. We're meant to perceive the hand of God bringing about a reversal of circumstances. The decree of death has now the promise of life. And we begin to feel a sense of hope for God's people in this moment. But as chapter 2 continues, Moses is now an adult man, and he sees the plight of his people, the Hebrew people, and he lashes out in rage, killing an Egyptian official. Moses flees the angry pursuit of Pharaoh and settles in Midian. Where does this leave God's people? As we come to a close of chapter 2, we read in verse 25, "During that long period the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God." Will God be faithful to his promise? Well, verse 23 says, "God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob." So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Well, because of God and his covenant, his promise with his people, and his loving concern for them, we should anticipate that God will indeed act and intervene, and that leads us to our devotion tomorrow. But for now, let's close with this reflection. The Bible gives us both a big picture view of God's movement in history and close-up looks at the lives of individuals. We've seen that today. How does this help you today? What is the big picture of God's promise that comforts you today? What is your personal situation? And how can you be encouraged by his love and concern for you personally?